Excellent, and we are recording and live, and people are popping in, so that's great. So we'll give everybody a few minutes, and then we'll kind of get going here in a second, Deb. So
sure.
So did your daughter have a baby boy or girl?
A little girl.
Oh, great.
Her name is Aoife. It's Irish. It's Aoife. So it's
Beautiful.
the Irish Gaelic for Eva or Eve.
Nice.
So yeah. So it's good. It's good. So I'm on grandma duty.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, my daughter's name is Isla, so it's funny because everywhere she goes, especially in school early on, they say Isla. So no, it's Isla. So we'll give everybody a few more minutes to pop in.
Sure.
Well,
thanks for giving me the opportunity to do this today. It's always fun to talk textiles.
No, and we're so used to seeing you, physically here in our building with your group and your tour. So it's nice to see you virtually. Yeah, we appreciate you taking the time to do this. I will go ahead and kind of just give everybody a little bit of a rundown. Let me just share my screen real quick. Let's just see. There we go. Okay. So everyone should be seeing my screen now. Welcome. This is a virtual market here at Universal Furniture. My name is Neil McKenzie. I head up marketing, and today we have Deb Barret joining us. Many of you know Deb from, I think, her tours, some of the consulting work that she does, her blog. Her and Jackie do a great job in terms of guiding many people through market, and we're excited to have her here today. Just for a lay of the land for people, if you're not aware, today we are showcasing kind of our new venture into special order upholstery. We're going to have a chat at 1 o'clock with Sean O'Connor, who's been leading kind of the charge for our efforts there. And we have some great content. You can kind of see some of the new fabrics and leathers that we're working with, hear from Sean on our website, also live at 1 o'clock with Sean. And then we're doing an Instagram live with our friends at Moore & Giles at 2 p.m. And then we do have a few other educational seminars today. Today at 11 with Deb, at noon with Krypton, a CEU with Krypton, and then at 3:30 with Moore & Giles. So hop on to universalfurniture.com/virtual market, and you can get in there. And then if you missed any of the educational features that we had on Friday, you can go in there to the educational portal, and today we will have video content posted for people to review anything that you may have missed. So Deb, I'm going to kick this over to you now. I see you, so I'll have you share your screen. And then the other thing I did want to add, for anyone that has questions or comments, you can use the little chat or Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And feel free to ask away. And Deb, I'm going to be quiet now and let you take over.
Okay, thanks so much for having me, Neil, and welcome everybody. We're going to spend the next hour talking a little bit about textiles and kind of journey to the south of France. That's where our story really begins today. It was named specifically Provence because it was named that because it was the first province outside of Italy. Provence in France is a region in the southeastern area bordered by the Southern Alps and the Mediterranean Sea and the Côte d'Azur, Saint-Tropez, etc. It's a really diverse landscape. It's awesome. I've visited there many times. The water and the soil is one of the reasons that it became the cradle of the textile industry. Bordering Provence on the north, sort of the quote unquote de facto capital of Provence, is the cultural center of Avignon, and it was once the papal center for the Roman Catholic Church. Once the Romans invaded, the invaders were followed by the traders, and in the early 1600s, both the Portuguese, the Dutch, and of course the Romans started stopping at the port of Marseille, and amongst them they were bringing exotic imports, and from that were some of the cottons and the silks, obviously from Asia and from India. And probably Provence is best known for what is called the Endines. So they're sort of gaily colored prints, which were definitely embraced immediately by the King Louis XIV. And in 1664, he had his Minister of Finance create the East India Trading Company and basically sent spies into India to learn the secrets of painting and printing of the cottons. And not only did Louis found the trading company, but he hired Armenian dyers and fabric makers to teach the know-how to the local producers. One of the things about Louis was that he was enamored with textiles as a way to differentiate himself as a country. He was seeing what was happening in Italy, and he wanted to replicate that, not only in the cotton fabrics of Provencal prints and chintzes and endines, but also in velvets and jacquards, as we'll see later in the presentation. So in Provence, these cotton fabrics, in spite of any industrial mechanization or the disappearance of the factories that have been popped up in workshops in centuries past, they've always been faithful to the ancient techniques. Today, they're either printed by hand, still hand blocked, or by big screens or brass rollers, roller printing. And all the prints are definitely inspired by the craftsman's drawing and sculpted just like they were 200 years ago. And really what sort of kicked it off, the sort of precursor, if you will, to Provencal fabrics were chintzes. So they were prized for their floral designs, their brightness. And one of the things about the Endines as they were coming over is they were color fast, something which was a know-how that the French and the Italians really didn't know, but the Indians did. They had mastered the idea that you could wash it and it wouldn't, the dye wouldn't come out. Most of them, again, were hand blocked or printed, and they were known by the Hindi word chitra or chint, which meant the smooth, shiny glaze, or colored or spotted. And so a lot of the chintzes were originally coated with sort of a waxy resin because they were made from a calico wheat ground cloth, which was sort of the plain version of unbleached cotton as we know it today, right? As I said, Louis, very enamored with textiles, right? And so along comes one of his many mistresses, Pompadour, and she loved chintzes, and she asked her agents to reproduce these printed textiles from India, but in a smaller scale, and was very successful, and soon production was all over the south of France. And actually in 1668, I believe, they were outlawed. A little bit more on that again, but first started out as apparel. You know, up until about the mid 1700s, we really didn't differentiate between home decor fabrics and apparel fabrics. A textile was a textile was a textile. So this happens to be from Pierre Frey's archives. This is a waistcoat from that time period. It was actually the print that you can see, and don't you love how it was lined? The peplon was repaired and lined, because the idea is you washed it, you repaired it, you upcycled it, you know, maybe you took the draperies down and did the same. This waistcoat inspired a brocante fabric several years ago. As I said, the chintzes were sort of the precursor to Provencal fabrics. As the fabrics became more successful and more popular around 1640, the Endines were soon being produced not only on silks, but on wools, and were being done native to France rather than being imported. They were so popular that the king was finding that the silk industry was being harmed by it. So the silk weavers protested to the king, and he enacted sumptuary laws and forbid the wearing of the Endines. As you can see, they were so enamored, they immediately adapted these colorful Endines for court dress. In fact, Molière satirized what was in vogue in 1670 by outlawing, or by showing the waistcoats and men's apparel with the prints, but the prints intentionally done upside down. So it really wasn't until about 100 years later that production was legalized again. But in those intervening years, what really happened is this whole underground printing industry was flourishing. Obviously, the Huguenots and the French were very resourceful, and they were printing it for themselves and for the peasant class, and they continued to gain popularity. So let's kind of back up a minute and talk about how these indines and this sort of industry was born, a bit of the history. Provencal fabrics are still being produced, or I should say, excuse me, were first produced throughout France using the same methods and designs that were used in the techniques that were imported from India. Usually they were set up in workshops to make the indines. They would carve linoleum blocks with flowers, arabesques, and other motifs using a fruit wood block. And then they would apply the blocks to the cotton by hand, one color at a time. In some cases, you'll see many, many blocks were used to do more of the intricate patterns. And then, of course, they were using natural dyes of the area, made from plants, from soil. Near Roussillon in Provence are the ochre hills, and that's where you get the wonderful bright oranges and reds and yellows from the soil, actually. So the colors are strong and vibrant. Over time, new motifs were introduced that really spoke to French and localism, local vines and flowers and insects and herbs. Provencal women loved to cover themselves with apparel, bedecked clothes. In fact, in some cases, you were your status was told by the type of layering you were doing with Provencal fabrics. Also, interestingly enough, a playing card, at that time they were printing playing cards, and it was done with wood engravers. One of the playing card manufacturers took that whole idea of how they were printing playing cards and applied it to the Provencal fabrication methods, because first you whitened and bleached all your fabrics, then you dried them and you decorated them in some cases with some stencils, and then blocked over them. I'm going to show you in a minute some of the technique that was done with hand blocking. You can see the prints. On the right here, what you're looking at is an antique piece, and notice the red, and then this sort of looks teal. This is probably this is very rare because the greens and blues tend to go away from the fabrics, particularly if they're washed. But the red or the madder was discovered actually by an American dyer in Lyon, and it's called grenals. And we didn't know, or French did not know this technique and how to get red dyes. Or green dyes for many years. Actually, how they would do the green was they would apply blue, and then they would over apply when it was wet the yellow to get the greens. So let's talk a bit about the hand blocking technique. So as I mentioned before, they're carved blocks of wood, and they're inked and then applied by hand to a plain cloth that's been applied to, in this case, almost like an adhesive to the table, so that it's very stiff, and you're not going to get any wrinkles, etc. in it. Mistakes are part of the characteristics of hand block prints. There's no vertical pattern repeat limits, and in some cases, you're using, tables that are 160 to 200 feet in length. So it's very, very labor intensive. As many of you designers know, if you're doing a hand block Lee Joffa or Scalamandre, for example, it might take 12 to 14 weeks, sometimes months to get it. So here you can see they're doing a tiny Provencal, and then here's the typical Provencal craftsman also using the blocks. The blocks are numbered by pattern, and then they're stacked up on shelves in archive, because one pattern could use as many as 100 blocks. It's an ancient method of textile printing, and probably originated in India. And not only is it about the preparation of creating the blocks, but then of the production of the actual cloth. As you can see here, once again, this is Patrick Frey in the Pierre Frey archives. I will say, if any of you are ever in Paris, please try to get an appointment. They love to have designers come in. He has an amazing archive, over 30,000 documents. Here he was showing us, actually this fabric was being printed. The inspiration was a Provencal print, and it was going in the Petit Trianon in Versailles. He was printing it for Versailles, and he was showing, here's a hand block print. Usually there are 4 needles, almost like nails or pins in each corner, and the idea is to match the needles up, or the needle marks up with the previous block so that you can basically repeat. There's 1 block per color. So here you can see they're carving blocks, very intricate. You use a softer wood like a fruit wood, and in some cases linoleum is laminated to the top. Here's an archive, another Provencal print that you can see. Just see if we can make this happen on a Zoom meeting. Hopefully I've got some really great, this is showing you the process of printing.
Hey, Deb, but I'm not sure bandwidth-wise if it's going to come through.
Okay, thanks.
But we can include a link when we post the recording of this.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, that was coming off of another site, so I'm going to move forward here. Whoops, sorry.
No worries.
Get back off. Get my screen back up. There we go. Anyway, it's very labor intensive, and you'll see in the video that they're blocking it, and it's 1 per color. And then what'll happen is they will actually go in and use almost like a tweezers and take care of some of the imperfections and do some shadings, etc., as the ink is wet. Now, Suliato, some of you who've been in the industry for a while might know Suliato. It was one of the most famous producers of Provencal and the oldest in Provence. It was under a lot of different names, and it's been owned by 2 families for over 2 centuries. In 1916, it was bought by Charles Desmarais, and he passed it on to his nephew, and was named Suliato, which means, as you can see, a ray of sun shining through the clouds. Suliato was a huge hit for Americans in the 70s, particularly when the 2 Pierres brought it to their Greenwich Village shop and named their shop named Pierre de, you might know Pierre de Fabrics, right? It's actually gone away. It tried to resurrect in the late 90s, early aughts, but it's definitely gone. Suliato parted ways with their cousin in the 80s, and they went on to focus in onto apparel. And it's kind of sad when you go to the museum and see it these days. But their cousin that they sold it to, who is still converting, is Olivades. Now, Olivades is not a familiar name for designers and textile people in the US because they don't have an agent in the US. But I will tell you that they are the converter for all high-end editors and fabric houses in the US. The Schumachers, the Lee Joffas, the Kravitz, the Scalamandres, you name it, Holland, anyone who's doing any kind of printed goods, Olivades is printing most of it. It's really interesting to see, but their roots were obviously started with the Provencal fabric. This is their shop in Saint-Étienne. And they kind of give you a really quick overview of how they're printing these prints today versus hand block. They're now doing screen prints. So the first thing is they get the gray goods in and they take the sizing off and they bleach them sometimes. Sometimes they'll also re-dye them so that they'll have a darker ground or a colored ground to give more of a raw look before they print it. Then they're going to mix the dyes in the kitchen. They use very strict formulas. Here's the colorway guide, and here are the formulas that the dyer and the master printer is using. This follows along with the screen printing as he's screening the prints. These are the screens. As you can see, they're literally the width of the goods, 54 inches. And they're sometimes to cut out of metal. Sometimes they're cut like a copper plate almost. Or they will be out of very thin scrim. You can see these men are actually taking it back to be washed after it's been printed onto the cloth. There's only a couple of places in the world that make them, obviously Lyon being one of them. The screen printing process is called à la lyonnaise because it's using this flat screen where the pattern has been cut through and then the color goes through the stencil and it's reproduced. This is the printing room. Just to give you the scale of the printing room, this is one of the tables. Metal tables, spray adhesive, they lay the fabric down onto it and then print off of it. Here they're pouring dye onto a screen to squeegee it. It is done by mechanics these days, but you can see the process is pretty amazing. This is actually a tablecloth, and they're printing tablecloths. When they're doing something like a panel print or actually almost all the time, they'll go every other one. So you can see here it's been printed, there's a blank space, and then printing so that they don't get any overruns on the dyes, if you will. Pretty amazing. Let's see. This is embedded. I'm going to tell me if it comes through. Neil. They're here checking for making sure there's no imperfections and that the screen is completely registered and lined up. Now he's going to move the squeegee up to the top. Going to pour the ink in, or the dye. And then it squeegees. Sets the screen down. And then he's squeegeeing it on. The reason I like to show these visuals to you guys is the understanding of you know, every time somebody touches a piece of fabric, it's another process in production that makes it cost more money. So now they're checking it out. So that, I mean, when you have customers that are saying, why is this, it's just a cotton print. Why is it, you know, $50 or $75? It's like, if you have an understanding of the process, it's going to mean so much more to your client to understand not only the price point, but the provenance and the design narrative behind it. So if any of you know me, you know that I am a huge Francophile and I am a little bit obsessed about toiles. So toile is another fabric coming out of France that's, you know, using cultural imagery and kind of tells a story of more idyllic times. For me, that's the draw because of the design narrative. And I always want to imagine what the artist's mind, you know, what he or she picked up the pen and when they started sketching that design, what was the design all about? Were they an observer? Were they a participant? Toile also stands for this whole idea of French ingenuity and joie de vivre and style. It's just ingrained in part of the French history. And typically they're mostly monochromatic textiles, started out on ivory and white grounds. So manual canvas is working in 5 and 6 different colorways now. Traditionally it was 1 and 2. They were also printed on wood blocks or After Oberkampf moved to France, started to be printed with copper plates. Famous artists of the time, Pillemont, for example, were doing the drawings, and he was reproducing them on cloth. He treated these like pieces of art with fine etchings and used, as I said, the copper plate. Once copper plates were introduced into textile printing, you got much finer lines. You could do shading effects, all kinds of wonderful things that you couldn't get from a hand block. So Oberkampf came to France at 18 and started building the textile factory near Versailles, interestingly enough. Once the sumptuary laws had been done away with in about 1759, basically he was instrumental in rebuilding the textile industry within France. And he developed this method of organizing all the different patterns and stimulating innovation when it came to design, because he was reaching out to the artists of the time. He also took it upon himself to become cutting edge and innovative in chemistry and mixing the dyes and the bleaches. His factory, you can visit his factory actually today, but the copper plating was sort of the precursor, if you will, of the Industrial Revolution. Here you can see. I want to show you. At the time on the selvage, you always had to make sure that you had the dyer, the printer, and the location on it. That's how it was all organized. So it was manufactured by Oberkampf, the printer, Ajou, which is near Versailles, and bon temps means that it was a good print. It was on register and it wasn't flawed, for example. The other thing about copper plates is it allowed you to increase your repeats to 18 inches, because with wood blocks, about 6 foot, wood blocks were much smaller in pattern repeats. And speaking of textile stories, one of the wonderful places to get loads of textile stories are, whether you're talking Provencal, velvets, jacquards, anything, are the document books. So every printer would always cut a piece of cloth and mark it and sample it. These are document books. This is basically the archives. This is basically sort of his sample book that he would show to clients, to the aristocracy. It was his history was all within these books, if you will. They're pretty, some of them are rare and really wonderful. Now, Sheen is another technique that's printing before we move into jacquards. So Sheen is a warp printing technique that kind of gives you that blurred edge to it. And what's really wonderful about it is it's that what you actually are doing is you're printing the warp yarns, as you can see here, prior to weaving them. And that's what gives you that blurred effect. It is very rarely done these days because it is so expensive. It's much easier to print a cloth with a screen print or a roller print to get that look versus having to do the actual Sheen technique. Le Monac is a French manufacturer. It's under the Pierre Frey house of brands, if you will. And Le Monac has developed a technique that, though expensive, actually is trying to bring warp printing back. And I thought it would be interesting to show you what that actually means. And because again, every time you touch a fabric, you're adding a price to it. So this is on silk. It's being done by a manufacturer actually in the Swiss Alps. I think they're moving production to Tours, or near Tours, where Le Monac is. So you take silk warp threads and you glue them onto a cotton canvas, and then you choose your colors for screen printing, and you literally screen print the yarns on that canvas on the printing table. As you can see, very similar to what you just saw with Olivades. They take the squeegee, check the mark, and they're printing the yarns. And then what'll happen is they'll take it off and they'll dry it. right? So you can see it's coming across the stencil. And these are yarns that are being printed. It's pretty amazing. 8 colors. They're rolling up the fabric. And what they're going to do is they're going to put it on a roller and they're going to pull the backing off, and all what's going to be left are the yarns that are colored. So these are the yarns in the front that you're looking at. And then they're going to put them on a warp beam, and they're actually going, after washing and drying, those are the yarns themselves. They're going to put them on a beam, on a jacquard loom, and they're going to weave them. It's pretty crazy amazing. Again, we'll give you links to all of these today so you can see this. Sorry, whoops, got to get out of this. Come on, there we go. I can't, sorry, bear with me here a minute. Get rid of the, there we go, share my screen. Get out of it. I won't show any more videos. It looks like that the bandwidth isn't allowing it. There we go. Now we're good, right? Nope. Gotta get out of it again. All right, now let's try it. There we go. All right. You can see how they're doing it and they're weaving. It's pretty crazy amazing. So also want to talk a bit before we finish up on jacquards. So jacquards are one of the 3 basic weaves. It's actually an attachment that's attached to a loom to form very complicated patterns on a simple background. So they're using either a twill, a satin, or a plain weave, and then they're inserting yarns. In some cases, as many as 1,200 yarns are inserted to create really intricate, wonderful patterns. You probably know damasks and brocades as being the most common of jacquard weaves. This happens to be farfalla from de Klerk, which is a very, very intricate jacquard. Okay, how jacquard weaves start out is with a textile design. It's typically placed historically on grid paper, and the intersection of each of the lines represented an intersection of the warp to the weft. And they would translate, so this design would be basically blown up. So this repeat on this design might have been 45 or 50 inches, and it might represent 2 inches of woven cloth, all starting from an original painting, and then translated by a draft weaver. Here's an example. This is sometimes they're called mise en cartes. This is a mise en carte below, and it's colored in its original document colorway, and then here it is woven as the jacquards. Yarns, shuttles. Today, jacquard weaves, the Valdez weavers of the world, obviously, everything is highly mechanized and at crazy high speeds, but there are still some jacquard looms in production today, both for passementerie and trim and for hand and machine woven. As I mentioned, Jean-Marie Jacquard invented this loom attachment that was allowing, it was basically the first mechanical attachment to a hand-drawn loom or a backstrap loom. And it was a system of cardboard or paper cards with holes cut out in them, and you would punch the cards with the awls. Then they would lace them together. This is one pattern repeat on the jacquard loom. This happens to be for trim. What would happen is you can see the card punches. This obviously is very intricate. What happens is where the hole is the reed goes up and pulls the shed up so that the shuttle can go through and insert the yarn on the weft to create the pattern. Here's a actual hand loom. This one's being set up for velvet, I believe. Here's another loom with the bobbins are all underneath with the silk threads. Here's the jacquard attachment on the top. Here it is. Today it's done with paper, as you can see. Feels very much like it's a binary system, obviously. Whole, no hole, 1, 2, just like primitive computer binary codes were. You can kind of get the scale of how it was, right? Most of the jacquard and silk industry centers in Lyon, as it still today. The chemicals and dyers are still there and still working globally. Lyon was chosen by Louis XIV when he decided to build the textile industry. There are still 2 firms that are working and producing goods today, Tassinari and Châtal, which is available in the United States. And here, I've seen some of their archives at one of my visits. Marie-Jean was showing us some really wonderful damask and brocades. And then, of course, Prell. Prell is kind of having a resurgence at Decaloff in January. They did an exhibition and brought in a new collection, which is they're very private and only up until this time, we're doing custom work, but now they've really opened it up into more mass, obviously, just probably because of the nature of the beast these days, right? What you're looking at here, which is really interesting, is so this is a jacquard. This is a brocade done on a jacquard loom. It's actually, as you can see the book open here, it's the king's bedrooms. They did all the hangings for the king's bedroom in Versailles. It took them about 20 years to weave this fabric. They also did the yellow room. Tassinari did the yellow room in the White House. Jackie Kennedy had ordered the fabric through the House of Jensen in the 60s. Kennedy was assassinated. The fabric went into the archives in the White House. And then when Michelle Obama was doing some refresh in the 90s, when she was First Lady, she found the original bolts of good because the original bolts uncut and had the yellow room redone to Jackie's specification. Here's another document of some of the jacquards that we do. Now, brocades are another, as I mentioned, common jacquard weave. This is one of the most expensive fabrics in the world. It's thousands and thousands of dollars, but it's all hand done. And so you've got a jacquard back and a moire cloth, and then you have these inserts of these florals. This is the back side. So you can see that the yarn is only inserted where the color is, or where the design is, I should say. How brocades are typically made are from a technical print or a weave draft or a mise-en-carte, as you see here. The weaver actually memorizes it, and it's working on a white cloth, as you can see here. And then he has a tray of bobbins set in front of him, one for each color, and he literally weaves those in by hand through the shed as he pulls the shed up. So you can see these are all the bobbins. So these are all the colors that are going in to create this design. And then he hits the shuttle, the shed goes up, he puts one color, he's memorizing it. Now, something also interesting is he never sees the front side of the fabric. He always works from the back side and only sees the reverse side. So they usually have a mirror underneath so they can see if they've made any mistakes, because then they've got to unweave it, which is pretty crazy, right? To see that. And I also have a link that works through what's involved with jacquard looms and brocades. It's pretty, to me, it's fascinating. I love it. Last but not least, part of the whole sort of French tour that we're on in the south of France is velvet. You know, velvet's, as we all know, is definitely very popular these days, and certainly one of the most seductive fabrics that's out there. It has origins in Italy in about the 14th century, meaning velluto or fleecy. Its term came from it. Louis XIV, as I mentioned, brought the weavers from Italy over to Lyon and established Lyon as the textile industry. Up until the Industrial Revolution, velvet was done by very, very skilled weavers, and it was typically silk velvets. If you've ever specified a silk velvet, you know that one of the issues is that it crumples and marks and crushes, right? So though it's very expensive, it's also a very fragile fabric. Here's where technology comes in these days. Fedini Borgia has a silk velvet on the market, and there's several new technical velvets coming to market. Some call them performance fabrics, but it's really more about the weave than it is about the finish. That can be used for upholstery. And what's great about them is that they're anti-crush. It's a new weave technique that they've developed with different looms to give you that feel of the silk, but and the luxurious and the depth of color and the depth of pile from silk, but not the crushability and the fragility of it. So velvet is a pile weave. So essentially what we're doing is inserting extra yarns from the pile into the face of the cloth. The ground cloth is usually a twill or a plain weave, and if you're uncutting the pile, you're making terry cloth. If you're cutting the pile, you're making velvet or velveteen or corduroy. So today, it's done very differently than what it was done historically. This is a velvet loom. As you can see, this is a gaufrage or a cut velvet. The velvet pile was only inserted into the design, and then you still see the ground cloth below it. But here's a draft of what it would be like. You would be inserting these little piles and then cutting them to get the pile. This is how we make velvet today. So essentially it's a double weave. We're weaving two sets of cloth at the same time, okay? And we're inserting a yarn between the two cloths, and there's a knife at the end of the loom. And as it rolls up onto the take-up, the knife is cutting the loop if it's for velvet or velveteen. So as you can see, we would slice across here, right? Historically, all these velvets, these are baccalavois, and this is tassinari. And this gal who's actually doing the weaving is one of 5 velvet weavers that are actively working today. And she's about 28 or 29. One of the things about weavers, particularly in hand woven, and same with hand blocking, is the weaver stays on this loom. It learns on that loom, and they stay on that loom forever because they understand how the loom works. Everybody's tension is different. Everybody's pullback on the pound is different. Same with the blocking. Everybody, hammering is different on the hand block. So you become very intimately connected to the design and the weave. And so you always work on that. Same with lace makers. Sophie Olay, which is a haute couture lace maker, has generational lace makers because one of the things is to learn how to lace a beam on a lace machine takes sometimes years because it's a month, 6 to a 9 month process to just change on the looms. It's pretty crazy. So again, we have a jacquard loom. We have the jacquard up at the top because we're doing a design. We can do velvet plain, as well as do designs. You're going to be using the jacquard to pull those shed up and those individual yarns to do the velvet weaving. What'll happen is you'll use these long pins. They look like big bobbins or pins with heads on it, and you insert one in every time that you pull the shuttle back and do the shed. And what that does is that the yarn wraps around the pin and creates the loop. And you'll do 4 or 5 rows of this, and then you'll stop, and you'll take out a razor, which this is her razor right here, and then you will slit along the channel. Here she is slitting it. She's pulling out the pin. Now you can hear a machine in the background. She's using a combination of hand-drawn and machine. There's the shuttle. Now she's cutting it. There's a little channel that looks like a little groove within the channel, and that's where it will fall. Probably one of the most favorite or famous velvets that's out there. Again, produced by Lamac, or Prel does a version. Le Tigre is theirs. This is the animal print velvet. It's again done by hand. It's pretty amazing to watch something like this to be done and to be produced. It's pretty crazy. Oops, sorry. Again, there's the jacquard. Notice how noisy it is.
Hey, Deb, it's Neil. I think it got hung up again.
Okay, sorry. This was embedded. I apologize. Should have checked with you before on that. So anyway, one of the things about velvets before I take some questions and tie this all up is, one of the things to know is, as you can maybe see here in the picture, is you can only do, you can only do about 6 to 7 inches a day. That's why it's so pricey. It can take 20 to 40 years to do a job if you're doing custom. But I hope I hope that you enjoy the design narrative that we had today and some of the textile stories I talked about. And if anybody has any questions, please feel free to share them. I don't see any questions. I'll give you a minute to answer them before we have to move on.
Yeah, where are you? I know you travel over to Europe every year, right?
Yes.
Were you all able to, you guys went in the fall, is that right?
And we go in the spring and the fall. We weren't able to do the spring because of obviously because of the lockdown, but we're going again. We're actually going in September. So we'll be going to Provence, and we spend quite a bit of time in Lyon and some of the textile places. And this year, we're also going to be doing London. Again, what's really we have a partnership formed with London Craft Week, and they moved London Craft Week to September, and we're participating in it. The members of our tour will be participating in it. It is pretty crazy, some of the behind the scenes stuff we're going to see, like with Vivian Westwood, and we're having lunch with Trisha Guild and some pretty amazing artisans and venerable design brands for both French and English. But thanks for asking. If anybody's interested, PM me or whatever about the tour. So we're hoping that everybody's going to be ready to feed their wanderlust by come September.
I think, I hope so as well. I think a lot of people, at the very least, leaving their house will be a major accomplishment, I think so.
Exactly.
This has been great. If anybody has questions, you can chat them over. We did record this session. We will post it and make it available, probably be available tomorrow for people to access if you did miss it. No, Deb, we really appreciate you making time for us and sharing this. This is really interesting.
Thanks so much, and I apologize for the video thing, but I will send the links to you, and if anyone's interested in seeing.
Yeah, we can put those in our notes. Yeah, that'd be great. It's all the virtual schooling.
Yeah, I know exactly. We're just getting used to it. Thanks so much, everyone.
All right, thanks so much. Take care. Bye.
Bye-bye.